Perfect. All right. Well, we're back here for another series. So welcome everybody. It's another one of our Autoimmune Webinar Series. And today we are diving into a subject that isn't really a mainstream conversation when it comes to autoimmune disease. So I've discovered in my own journey and the journey with some of my clients that it has a very significant impact on our ability to truly heal. And I've spent years on a physical journey and finally had to dive into more of an emotional healing journey, specifically stress due to trauma. And I wanted to make sure that we had it here as part of the series. So I invited this beautiful woman, and you do look beautiful tonight, thank you, to see if she might be willing to come in and have a discussion about it with me as part of the series. And thankfully, she said yes, and yay for me, and yay for all of you. So her name is Marisa Wandeler, and she is a traumatic stress coach, and she has enjoyed a 25 career as a self-care and physical transformation expert. Inspired by her clients' courage and knowing her own story involved a painful past, she began diving into her wounds and trauma in an attempt to heal her autoimmune disease and emotional struggle. This guided personal growth changed her life emotionally, mentally, professionally, and especially physically. She now uses a trauma-sensitive approach to the whole body healing and transformation in her coaching of others on their healing journey. So Marisa, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Me too. So I'm hoping that we could start at the beginning a little bit. And would you mind giving the audience a brief explanation of what autoimmune disease you struggle with, and then please describe why you felt or how you knew your own trauma struggles were affecting your autoimmune disease?
Okay, well, thank you for having me, and I will attempt to be brief, but the list is long.
Right.
So I kind of wrote all of this out to make sure that my story didn't get lost in all of the diagnoses. So I'll just begin by saying that I've had some kind of medical issue since toddlerhood, since as long as I can remember. In fact, some of my first memories were what I now know to be urinary tract infections as a toddler and a preschooler, and how painful that was. And I also remember most of my childhood having some form of a frequent stomach ache, which, you know, when you're a kid and it's all that you ever know, you can tell your parents you're in pain, but there really is no way of going farther with that. So what I want to say was I had no sense of satiation as a child, meaning that pain that was so chronic really affected a lot of things, involved like my hunger. I was an obese child, and I was hungry all the time, and I never felt full. And even as a child, I didn't know what that meant. And that's important to my story only in that it really came up later in life. I began having pelvic pain and extremely heavy menses within a year of starting my period as a young girl. And I was taken to doctors for this, but there was no explanation. There was no resolution. In fact, I just adapted to dealing with the pain until college, when right before college, I had lost a lot of weight in high school, and it got a little bit better. But when I did have the pelvic pain spells, it would just completely knock me out. Like I couldn't even get out of bed. It was really brutal. Well, I ended up having a cyst rupture in my ovary in college. And at that time, I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome, fibroids, and endometriosis.
Oh my God.
And so, so of course, I didn't know anything about anything then. And so, of course, the doctor said, take this birth control pill. It's going to solve everything. Well, within 3 months of taking that birth control pill, I discovered a lot of pain in my calf that was getting worse and worse. And I ended up being in the rare population that develops a blood clot from hormonal therapies. And so had to stop taking the pill. And so this was ultimately just kind of like, okay, well, I guess there's no answer. I'm just going to have to deal with this. Every doctor I went to couldn't figure me out. I didn't, quote, you don't make sense. I didn't follow the textbooks. And so every physician just kind of pawned me off to the next specialist. So I ended up dealing with this for a really long time, had several laparoscopic surgeries, and ultimately ended up having all of my reproductive organs removed one by one. I could just never get my hormones in checked. And the reason why that is significant is in the area of my emotional struggles. I was having trouble breathing. I was having a lot of headaches. I would have tremors in my hands. And no one could explain that to me either. Well, after all of this kept happening over and over again, I ultimately gave up. And during this time, you know, I finished college. I'm a true academic. I love to read. I love to research. I was building a successful business around medical exercise. I had developed a specialty in inflammation and cancers, in particular women's cancers. And I was enthralled by how the body responded to stress. And so I read everything I could on those topics. But in 2010, a colleague who actually was renting space in my facility said, you know, Marisa, I've gotten to know you. You eat perfect. You only drink water. You exercise perfect. You've eliminated every inflammatory food in your diet. You take all the supplements. You take everything the doctor recommends. You do all the right things and still your body struggles. No one should have to live with such little margin in their body. Something is definitely wrong. And so he really encouraged me to go back and to really, you know, he actually kind of spearheaded the search, try to find specialists after specialists. He was a medical professional as well. And so he led me to the right functional gastroenterologist that then diagnosed me with celiac disease and Hashimoto's. So yay, I must have a cause.
Right.
That must be what's causing everything. And those two diagnoses actually made a huge difference in the management of my symptoms, in that I could finally take, you know, a thyroid pill that was going to help me with that. And the celiac disease, it was hard, completely eliminating gluten and everything associated with gluten, but I did it. And I thought I was on the right track, but every time I would go and do blood work, those antibody levels were staying strong and high.
Damn those antibodies.
Yes. And I couldn't figure it out. And even that panel of physicians that had become friends ultimately and colleagues were saying, like, we don't know. We don't get this.
Right.
And that same colleague who had sent me to figure out everything out said to me, but if there's one person who can figure it out, it's you. So I started reading absolutely everything I could on autoimmune disease, research papers, webinars, workshops, trainings. And it all helped me map the symptoms back to one place in my brain. And even though I didn't fully understand it, as I studied that portion of the brain, I had already been addressing every area that I could, except the one that the literature kept saying over and over affected it most, which was trauma. So I remember when it finally kicked in, that my traumatic past was probably the most influential factor in everything that was happening in my body. And I remember just thinking to myself, I have been in survival mode all this time. And that's when I began my own intentional trauma journey. That's when I decided, you know what, I want to do what's right by me. And honestly, it's made all the difference after all these years, mentally, emotionally, but most of all, physically.
Right. I remember the first time I heard that, I was at a Chopra Center event in Chicago, probably in the maybe 2007 or 8, when they said that there isn't one person that has autoimmune that doesn't have trauma. And I remember thinking, oh, screw that. Like, there's no way that that's true, right? And here we are today talking about this, right? And thank you, because it isn't always easy talking about our own journey, but I really appreciate you sharing. And I was thinking before we dove too much further into the discussion of how trauma affects our healing, it might actually be good to help with a little bit of education, because there is such a stigma around the word trauma. And would you mind defining that for us?
Absolutely. And this is something I'm really passionate about, because I think that there are a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misinformation about what trauma is.
Right.
Trauma occurs anytime someone's emotional, physical, and spiritual requirements, like what the body is demanding, cannot be met with those internal resources. So trauma is actually about impact in the body and not what happens to a person. It's a physiological experience. It's chemistry. And because it's an experience and not a categorical incident, a lot of people think trauma, car accident, incident. And that actually isn't what the trauma is. The trauma is the physiological experiences that we have through those kinds of incidents. And because we are all equipped internally in varying degrees, trauma affects each one of us in a different way. In other words, we were all born with a different DNA sequence of our brain chemistry, and that brain chemistry is designed to cope with traumatic things that happen to us. But often because we have no definition of that, right? Like, you know, for some people, it's the first time they're hearing this physiological experience definition of trauma. Because we're not culturally aware of that, we just think trauma is like the bad things that happen to people, but they're on a scale of intensity, right? Like, oh, my trauma is, you know, just this little old thing, and that person's trauma is like a really big thing. But in reality, it's about the impact on the body. So someone can experience something horrific and have very little physiological experience, and someone can have something that culturally seems like a very mild event or a mild thing and have enormous impact on the body.
So this is why, like, two children could grow up in the same family but have a completely different experience with the family, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So that makes sense to me. I was hoping also that you might dive a little deeper into why physical healing can only take us so far, and why is it that our emotional struggles or trauma, now that you've explained it, can hold us hostage in our illness.
So even though there's a lot still to be learned about the brain, we do know that the HPA axis, which stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, plays a really important role in how our body responds to stress. Again, at the physiological level. So the HPA axis is the interaction between your hypothalamus gland, your pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. And all of these glands govern your body's hormone production, full stop. All of us who have autoimmune conditions, like, lots of light bulbs should go off. If something is going to alter our hormones, that definitely has something to do with our autoimmune impact. And so when those things are not balanced, or the HPA axis isn't functioning synergistically, then the body has to adapt and it has to adjust. And so that's why anytime your body's resources are not enough for the need or the demand of that moment, then adaptation actually happens. It must happen for us to survive. So physiologically, trauma literally turns on the body's survival chemistry. But if trauma is frequent, repressed, unaddressed, or if the brain is too immature to know how to adapt, then the survival chemistry remains. It's almost like hitting the on button and there is no off. There's nothing in the body that turns it off. And this is why trauma, as it affects the brain, especially in early childhood, causes the body to adapt and essentially burn in a stress response. In other words, it learns an incorrect stress response. And because of that, it starts to affect our hormones and all of that chemistry that is downstream from those hormones to be affected. And so one thing I do want to say to that, because a lot of people might be thinking, well, childhood trauma, what does that mean? But to the brain, childhood is that age all the way up until maturity, which isn't until about 25 years old for most adults. So when we say childhood, the earlier it is, the more impact. At the same time, anything that happens to the non-mature brain, which is, you know, on average before the age of 25, has a propensity to really affect the HPA axis and how it functions in the body, and how it actually leads the rest of the body into, like, everyday living.
So that's, like, I find this topic absolutely fascinating, and it's leading me to so many questions, more than I actually had planned to ask, right? And I think that so many of us with autoimmune, and myself included for a long time, we assume that by addressing every little trigger, because, right, it's the three things, right? It's your genetics, it's your leaky gut, and it's your triggers. Nobody says number 4 is trauma, right? So we're all out there working towards this state of remission by eliminating our triggers and fixing our fixing our leaky gut, right?
Yeah.
And thinking that things are going to get better. And I am absolutely a classic example of this because I have peeled that onion. I have peeled my onion. And even though there are days that I feel I'm just barely maintaining where I am for all of my hard work because of the emotional work that I still have to do. And now I do want to say for everyone that's listening, all of that hard work peeling the onion is still necessary. It's always necessary, but the emotional or the trauma component is just another piece of the puzzle that needs attention. And actually, when I was talking to you yesterday, we were talking about this, right? Like I'm sitting there, you're talking about your number as we talk about our numbers, right? With autoimmune, I'm talking about my number and I'm so pissed off because I can't get it below 180 and I've done everything possible, right? And you've been at yours for a long time and damn it, that number is still where it is. But tell everyone what we talked about yesterday. That would be great.
So I think a part of the impact of trauma as it relates to the body's physical symptomology, like how it actually manifests, in some ways, the longer that there is repression or that the longer the HPA axis is not functional, the longer your body has actually had an opportunity to create its own homeostasis. And so what we were talking about with numbers is your frustration of getting it, to that number. I've never been at your number. I'm still not there, but I started in the thousands, right? Now, for me, having undiagnosed celiac disease, which now, when I told that story of I remember having stomach aches and I remember all this thing as a child, celiac disease isn't something that is just like spontaneously shows up, right? I know that was an issue from childhood. At the same time, the homeostasis of my body had 3 decades of adjusting to that before I ever knew anything about adjusting or, doing things with medications to help my thyroid. And so for me, hovering around the 300s has actually led me to a really good place. I feel really good in my body. Not to say that I'm not still adjusting, right? I still take all my supplements. I still eat right. I still exercise. I still do all the other facets of good self-care for autoimmune disease.
Right.
But at the same time, my body is only going to get to a place that it can get. And it would be unrealistic and unkind for me to expect everything to go back to textbook level because I don't have a textbook experience. My body doesn't have a textbook experience. And so a lot of times I think we focus so hard on what are the numbers and what does that say that we forget really the focus is ultimately like, how do we feel?
Right.
What kind of margin have we built in our body? I know that if I forget to take, for example, my vitamin C, for a day or two or whatever, I'm going to be okay. That wasn't the case in the beginning, but it is now. So you almost in some ways have to think of your body as, that young child or that teenager or young adult that was in that place of trauma. You have to think of your body as almost in some ways like, hey, I did the best I could with what I had at the time.
Yeah.
And anything that we do now to facilitate that process is going to be a good thing. But the expectation that the body is going to automatically look like a textbook, it's just unrealistic.
Okay. So we sort of talked about this a little bit yesterday, right? Because I think we should talk a little bit more about the gains that we've got. Even we put in all this physical hard work, but I think before when we were feeling our shifts, right? We have a good day, we're shifting, we're going to be down for several days when the shift happened previously. Now, when the shift happens, and we can feel it now because we learn how our body whispers to us. And you can know almost immediately as soon as you're starting to make that shift, and you know what your body requires to either support the shift, support your body, stop it, whatever it needs. But we become that in tune with ourselves, right?
Right. And really ultimately that's the goal.
Yes.
The goal is to be a kind responder to the moment.
Right.
And for me, I know when I'm coming down with something. I know when my body is struggling. I mean, all autoimmune conditions have flares. I know within the first day going towards that direction. And I know what to do to head that off, to really help my body kind of pull itself back into a place of really good function. So I think that as we talk about gains, the gain isn't like, ooh, I've got to get my, T3 number or my TPO, my antibodies to this specific number. The gain is I have energy at 5 o'clock in the afternoon that I didn't have when I was 16 years old,
Right.
that kind of thing. And so I think that is the gain that we look at, okay, I know what it feels like to feel good now. And when I don't feel good, I get to ask my body, hey, what's going on? And because of the trauma healing, I have learned how to listen to my intuition. I have learned the language of my body, and thus I can give a kind response to it.
Right, right. It's about stopping beating ourselves up so much, right? Because we
Yeah.
do. I think, I wrote a little bit about it today in the blog that I released. At the beginning of the illness, we're mad. We're mad because our bodies have let us down. But the reality is we might be letting our bodies down, to some
Right.
degree,
Mm-hmm.
but not really realize it. And
Mm-hmm.
this is part of the journey also, is listening to the body and realizing that we have more responsibility. It's just not here it can't just exist in the way maybe that we had been treating it, or the world provides treatment to us now, but we have a responsibility to make sure that everything we're doing for ourselves supports our health and our healing. And if you're unwilling to make that journey, then you're just going to be in that place forever. It's a journey that you have to accept. And this is part of it too, right?
Right. Right. Absolutely. And I think even as we're talking about the journey aspect of it, it is the journey, right? I mean, in some regards, as the brain is healing and as the brain is essentially reprogramming itself to create different stress responses, we're also having to adapt to that, right? We're also having to know, what's going on. For example, I know that I had eaten gluten before the celiac disease and never felt like I had a response. Well, now that it's been a long time without gluten, if I get any by accident or whatever, oh, I know within 20 minutes.
Yes.
And now my body's response is different than it used to be. And so now I've had to do the work of, okay, that's how I used to respond.
Right.
This is how I respond now. And that process happens continuously, because right now I'm still healing and you're still healing.
Yes.
And that process continues, and we have to be able to ebb and flow with that so that we can know what the kind response is. Sometimes the kind response is to go for a really vigorous, exercise routine or jog, but sometimes the kind response is just to lie on the ground and meditate and be still for 5 minutes. And
Right.
Knowing the difference between the two of those for your body makes all the difference in the world.
Yes, it really does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
From your perspective, can you please give everyone an idea of what it means to heal trauma? And I don't know if I've asked the question the right way, but maybe a better way to ask what I'm thinking is, if a client wanted to know what it was going to take to heal their trauma, what would you say to them?
Well, first I would say that it isn't it is just as complex as you think, but it isn't as hard as you think. In other words, anxiety is often felt in the gut, but so is angst and frustration and fear and loneliness. And sometimes we just go, oh, I have a stomach ache, paying no attention whatsoever to, actually, was there an emotional precursor that maybe this isn't like a tummy ache from eating something bad or a sickness. Maybe this is actually a somatic meaning mind body, a somatic response to something that bubbled up emotionally. And the reason why that's important is because that's how you know the adequate response. And so if someone were to say to me, how do I go about this trauma healing business? What does that look like? it always starts with awareness. It always starts with building your emotional intelligence. You know, I've had clients who have started with me who have said, I know 3 emotions: happy, sad, mad. And that's
Right.
it. And to be able to dig into emotional intelligence in a way that says, actually, you could be experiencing 200 different emotions in the day, and those emotions are actually not feelings, right? The emotion leads us to the sensation that is a feeling, and being able to go back, like literally backtracking our symptoms or our sensations into the emotion, then we can go to the brain and say, oh, yeah, you don't have to respond to fear with a stomach ache. Here's another way. And there's a lot of nuanced, you know, that's kind of what I do. There's a nuanced piece to the trauma healing. But if someone were to say, what do I have to do? Essentially, you have to be willing to dig into your emotional intelligence, build it, and then allow yourself whatever it takes to stay aware of that.
Right. Yeah. Which can be a little bit of a journey because, like me personally, when you walk in and ask me how I'm feeling, I don't have words for that. When I'm asked to write down emotions that I'm experiencing, I'm having to actually go look those words up for the definition of them, because I don't have always an emotional experience. I have learned to live within my intellect to accommodate things that happen to me in my life, because the emotional side of things has been very difficult and hard.
Right.
So I think for a lot of people that come in to see you, the response may be similar, right?
Right. And it's on a spectrum, because while you might have struggled with having words, I have clients that they have too many words. Like there's so many words going on in their head that
Right.
it feels like chaos.
Okay.
And there's so many emotions happening simultaneously that even to try to begin the process of dissecting them and making them one by one, to do that alone
Yeah.
feels really overwhelming. So trauma and trauma healing happens on a spectrum, and it's different for everyone because we're all different. And our genetic expression of that trauma has been different, and our personalities are different, our
Right.
lifestyles are different, our
Right.
belief systems are different. And so because of that, that when we do, you know, basically engage in the things of our past or our current situation that are traumatic, it's, I think I say this more than anything to clients: how are you feeling? And then we have a conversation. And then the follow-up to that is, okay, now what's the kind thing to do with that?
Right.
Right. And that building of not just awareness, but also appreciation for the fact that we don't have to go back to the traumatic experience to heal it. We only have to know, how has the body responded to trauma now? And how can we address that now? And
Right.
so for some people, they think, well, I don't want to remember all those bad things. Well, it isn't about memory. It's
Right.
about experience. It's about how your body is experiencing those memories today. And so that's where we start. That's where we offer kindness. That's where we offer like a lot of emotional language, like what you just said. The building of that language is so important. And
Right.
that's why it is a process and it is a journey, because we have to learn. We have to unlearn some things and we have to relearn some things, because again, this is chemistry. This is so much happening in the brain.
Right. It is a lot. It is a lot. Um, so a question that I know I've had, and I imagine other people might have, is it necessary to undertake this very hard work? And maybe what would happen if a person chose not to address their emotional trauma?
Well, repression takes a toll on the body. And I think that all of us at some point in time, we just reach a tipping point where we've had enough of the struggle and we're ready, honestly, for resolutions and rest, whether we
Yes.
know it or not. So when people reach that point, the trauma healing can be a really good avenue to pursue in conjunction with everything else. But I fully acknowledge that sometimes we're in seasons of life that it isn't kind to address those things, that it would be more harm than good to go into those spaces. And if you're someone who hasn't tried all the other avenues of self-care, which especially with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, you know,
Right.
I can do all the trauma healing in the world, but if I'm not supporting my chemistry as well through supplements and,
Yeah.
you know, proper care of my body, I'm still not going to see the same result. It's a very synergistic thing. So I always encourage people, do what you know you can accomplish and achieve well. Do what feels kind and that you can be consistent with. And so if that means you're starting with the blood work and you're starting with the supplements and things like that, then do that. But ultimately, when you do reach the tipping point, you can ask yourself, what's the kind thing to do here? In essence, what I'm saying is, if we were to ask ourselves all the way along this journey, okay, now what's the kind thing to do? I think a lot of us would end up in the places of trauma healing. But if we don't end up in the places of trauma healing, just by giving yourself that validation of kindness, you are well on your way to helping your brain think about life differently and think about your stress responses differently.
Right.
In other words, there's hope. Like whatever you choose, there is hope. But trauma healing is definitely something that affects the chemistry that we all want to improve.
Right. Exactly. So, I debated a little bit how much we dive in, because I think people like an example, more of an example, of what this means. And I'm happy to use myself. However, I don't even really know where to start. But I think maybe you probably have a better perspective on it when I first came to see you and why I was there. And I'm happy to interject, but I'm happy to put this out there so people have a really good idea of what this might be really. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're giving me permission to use you as an example,
Yes.
I will.
I'm giving you permission.
Right. So it is also, I don't know how much science or research is backed by this, but a lot of us who have experienced traumatic themes, we tend to be real go-getters. We're high IQ. We're not all of us are type A personalities, but we tend to know how the world runs and we make sure that it does. And so I think that you fall into that category of just really high capability femininity, high capability achievement, high capability presence everywhere that you go. Yeah. And I think within that, while we can praise that and say, hey, Tracy always deserves a seat at the table, right?
Right.
When you came to me, one of the first things I said was, I can't imagine the pressure that puts on you.
Right.
All the time.
All the time.
To show up with that level of intelligence, with that level of academia, with that level of knowledge. That's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure for me, right? Sure. And once we started digging down towards like, hey, you don't have to have a rough and tough exterior in order to honor the interior. In other words, you can be fierce and tender in a very, very beautiful way. Yeah. And I think in your journey, helping you realize that you could honestly validate that pressure. You could say, you know what, you're right. Sometimes I don't like the pressure. Sometimes I don't feel at home in a space because it's too much for me. And I can even see your face even like
just
what's going on
listening
for you.
to you. Oh my gosh, I know. I can hardly wait to see it later because I'm watching you and I can feel my eyes starting to be like, oh, here we go. Right. Mm-hmm. But it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So even in that, like if you and I were in a session right now, I would ask you, and you don't have to full disclosure, but I would say, what do you feel like? What does it feel like inside your body for someone to see you and to see all that pressure that the world has put on you?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's a place that fuels me, but I've learned to like that because part of me, here we go, doing that is a way of getting approval and attention that I probably wasn't getting otherwise, right? Mm-hmm. So it's something that I've learned. But it also is a way of avoiding everything else that is going on. But here I go again, like I'm completely speaking from an intellectual perspective. I'm not really answering her question. From a body awareness perspective, which I'm really, really good at, I feel like I've been this bottle under pressure my whole life. from an emotional perspective, it's very lonely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that even for the audience as an example, I'm noticing, even when I said I noticed a change in your face, like I'm noticing her body language with curiosity. Did her shoulders go up in a shrug? Did she kind of go like do an internal kind of a childlike posture? Did she pull away? All of those types of things are indicator of how the body, the somatics of your chemistry are responding to the moment.
Right.
And so for me to join, basically to join you, Tracy, in this space, is essentially telling your brain like, hey, it's okay for once to let your guard down.
Right.
And when we engage in that process, the brain is able to go, okay, wait a minute, this is totally different than what I've experienced before.
Right.
So I have to create different chemistry. And so when I create different chemistry, then the next time this kind of level of vulnerability comes up, it doesn't feel as scary. It doesn't feel as, in some ways, that pressure, that bottle under pressure. Now, we're not taking the lid off and letting it explode.
Right.
We're essentially like, if it was a balloon, I like the example of the balloon where it's a little pinprick where we're just like letting a little bit of that pressure out at a time.
Right.
And so that's what makes the process a process. At the same time, those of us that do live with that level of pressure, just letting a little bit of air out is like, oh my goodness, I can breathe better. I had no idea that I was I was shallow breathing.
Right.
Until now. And now I'm like, oh, I must have been shallow breathing because
right.
I feel like I can breathe better. Right. And that, I think my question back to you for everyone else is, what is the experience on the other end, on the end of like, okay, I've been vulnerable. You and I have had an opportunity to work through naming those emotions and that narrative. And then on the other side of it, we always do a body check-in. Like, okay, what's different? What's different in your body on the other end of those interactions?
Right. So from the beginning to now, like at the beginning, I would have had a very, very difficult time even just voicing because my chest would get so tight and breathing would be so hard because I've held it in so much for so long. I can actually breathe. And I realize right now that this video is going out. I mean, I'm live on Facebook.
Yeah.
For me to actually be this way live is a huge step for me.
Yeah.
But I'm peaceful with it because I think people need to understand that you can make progress. And how long have we been at this? For a year, maybe?
I always tell people forever and not long enough.
Right. But, from a time frame, and everybody's story is different. But what I say is I walked into this open and ready, and I have just allowed myself to be myself. It's another space where I can actually be myself and feel safe, which I really appreciate. Because a lot of us don't have those spaces. So it lets me make the progress and it lets me learn how to be aware and to feel and to recognize the progress that I'm making because it's also affecting my physical progress.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
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 So.
And I think that your vulnerability for everyone today is stunning. It really is. And not but, and your vulnerability then becomes, in some ways, the really good contagion of allowing somebody else to have an imagination for what it looks like for them to express safe vulnerability. And again, like, I just want everyone to know, this is a process, and Tracy trusts me not to let her be too vulnerable, right? Because there is a safety aspect in that. And at the same time, I know how her window of tolerance has really expanded over time because she's done the work. And so even what you've just expressed is kind of like a broad example of all the many different things that are happening internally that allow you to kind of put one step in front of the other.
Right. I think when I made the choice to come in and do this is that, I mean, I remember asking the question that I asked you was with regards to another person in my life and how do I help them? And you turned around and said, I think this is more of a process about you. And in that moment, I remembered all the things I'd learned, right, about autoimmune and trauma. And I'm like, oh, damn it, here I am. And this is a door that has just been opened for me. And I can either continue to avoid this or I can just walk right through this door. So I chose to walk through the door. I've actually had people, that have been curious that I've talked to about have said to me, why would you want to do this to yourself over and over again? And for me, I look at it as I don't have a choice, right? I want to live a healthy life. If this is limiting my ability to have a healthy life to the point that I want to have a healthy life, I have a very big idea of what I want my life to be. I want to be here and I want to live it. So I have walked through this door at whatever cost to me that it is. And we talked about this yesterday, and I would love for you to talk about this. That this is what I have to do to have that life that I want for myself. So I'm in it till, and maybe I'm in it forever, because maybe it just continues as an evolution of me to achieve that I can ultimately be, because there's a lot of things I want to do, but I guess my point is I feel like I don't have a choice. So when you opened that door, I shoved myself through that door and then I slammed it shut, and here I am,
Yeah. And we all come to that place in a different way, and with different resources, different timing, different pace to this process. I know for me, my personal trauma healing process was because I had so much going on in me symptomatically. I remember walking out of, and I do want to say this really quick, trauma coaching and somatic coaching is different than traditional counseling. You can have a trauma-informed counselor, but the counselor does what, in the brain, frontal lobe work, essentially prefrontal cortex, talk therapy, the cognitive piece of trauma healing. And that is super, super important. And what I come in with is the other part, the reptilian part of the brain, that kind of thing. What is your body, the body's experience? Well, for me, my body's experience was awful, because after I would do my sessions, I would go home and cry. I remember crying in the shower. And after the first kind of 2 or 3 months, and I would cry in the shower because I was freezing, like literally couldn't control my body temperature, couldn't regulate myself in any way. So I would cry in the shower thinking to myself, why am I freezing? Why is this happening? And then I would go to sleep, and either I was so tired that I felt like I just needed to sleep for 10 years and I couldn't, or I was like, I couldn't wake up. So you know what I mean? Like, this journey that we are on with trauma healing, it becomes evident very quickly that your body is responding. Yeah. And that's also part of the process. That's also part of the, like what you're saying about pushing yourself and slamming the door behind you. I definitely, in that analogy, was like, you can still turn around and open that door.
Right.
Right. It's always about kindness, and it's always about offering yourself choices and your body choices that the trauma took away.
Right.
And so just knowing that as we journey in these places, and even as you just said, like, you're in it for the long haul, a lot of that is because, you've seen it. You've seen, like, my body is responding to my authenticity and my attempt to be more and more authentic in who I am and who I am in these emotions and in these experiences that can be labeled as trauma.
Right. So, and just as an example, like that was your experience with your early stage of trauma, my trauma counseling. Mine has been, even though I might have a difficult session and I find myself very drained, as soon as I walk out your door or the conversation is over, I am so charged and energized from that pressure release that I just had that I could take on a bloody marathon. Like, and so this is how I know it's right for me. Like, everybody has their response, but that's how I know I'm in the right place.
Yeah. And actually in the totally opposite and the same way, that's how I knew I was in the right place. Cause I thought to myself, this is why I've been freezing my entire life.
Yes.
This is why I have never been able to get warm, which honestly now that I can get warm, like I feel like I've had made a lot of improvements in my body temperature regulation. Now I'm like, man, the world is hot.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, summer is hot. I used to
Summer
look
is hot.
forward to summer
Yeah.
because I thought, oh, I'll have some semblance of being warm. And now it's like, okay, wait a minute. This is a heat I've never had before, but I get to celebrate that because now it's kind of like, okay, my freezing hands and toes make a little bit more sense.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
All right. So I know I'm probably missing a big question in all the questions, and we've kind of wandered away from, the structure that I have, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm all good with free flow. But what else would you like to tell the watchers that we haven't already covered?
Well, one thing that we didn't cover that I feel like is important, and this is literally not even a dipping the toe in the water. This is just like skimming a rock over it.
Yeah.
Is there is an element to ancestral trauma. And we do know that the DNA of our body and the expression of it, right, the contents of it are, reflections and shadows of our ancestors.
Right.
And so a lot of times people will say, well, I don't know that I've experienced anything significant. We have a lot of studies about Holocaust survivors and about what that has actually cost 2, 3, up to, present day generations, what that's cost in the body of those ancestors. So we know that sometimes it isn't even our own traumatic experiences, but it is essentially how our body has been given to us through our ancestors that gives us a lot of information as to why our body copes with life in the way it does. And so sometimes people say, well, man, nothing really big has happened to me, but maybe their parents or their grandparents were immigrants, or they had really significant abandonment issues, starvation, poverty. So, then we start talking about like, okay, what does that look like? How does that manifest in your life now? And all of a sudden light bulbs start going off like, oh my gosh, I do panic every time I get hungry. Like
Right.
I actually panic. And when we talk about those things that are ancestral, I always tell people, this is why the venturing into trauma healing is not just about, okay, I have to share all my stories and then figure them out. Sometimes it's about helping the body have a language of expression from previous generations, from things that are like, oh my goodness, that makes so much sense that my grandmother said that to me, or my mother said that to me, or my father said that to me. And so many times when we can allow ourselves to not just say, okay, this is my story and that's the end. When we can allow ourselves to actually be the embodiment of multiple generations, right, of ancestors, we actually have a lot opened up to us that isn't opened up to us in any other way. So I do want to say that just for the people that are like, okay, but I have Hashimoto's and I can't think of a single thing, those types of things. Just this isn't a catch-all. This is a very complex field. It's a very complex way of looking at the brain, and there's a lot more to it. And I also want to say to people, this is fascinating. If you're someone with autoimmune condition, now that Tracy has put it in front of you, you can just Google trauma and stress. And all of these amazing researchers and the science that has come out in the last 15 to 20 years will just floor you. If you want to learn more, start doing your own research. Be your own advocate. Read a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Read anything by Gabor Mate, Peter Levine, Stephen Porges, the polyvagal theory. None of what I'm saying is hidden information. No. All of this information is out there, and just reading a book, I mean, I know that all of my clients, when they read books, it's like hundreds of ahas are happening just from their own self-advocacy, just from reading those books. And so for people out there that are going like, well, I don't know that I'm ready for any of this. This is all brand new. Yeah. Educate yourself.
Right.
Do the research, be your own advocate, see where you fit into the spectrum of how trauma affects the body, and see if you can find some literature that might help you make sense of your symptoms, or maybe some of the ways that you react or don't react, maybe some of the ways that you are prone to think that is different than the way other people think. Does that make sense?
100% makes sense. And I remember, I picked up some of those books when, and I think another one was When the Body Says No.
Yeah, that's Gabor Mate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I also picked up a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child. And I was like,
Oh,
oh
yeah.
my gosh, like I'm all over the pages of this damn thing, but even though, I say things like that, at the same time, I'm like, oh, thank you, because there are answers. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
um, the other thing, I wanted to touch on the conversation we had a little bit yesterday about the cost. Do you remember?
Emotional cost.
Yeah. And I mean, this is our payment, kind of,
Right.
Do you remember?
So, yeah. So, what I was talking about, this was kind of a piggyback to the conversation about numbers, right? And about our expectation of numbers. Well, in some ways, I feel like my body had a lot of debt to pay off in terms of emotionally.
Yeah.
I had no other resources but to repress it, to push it down, to dilute it, to pretend that it wasn't there. And so, oftentimes, we forget that there is a cost. There's a cost in living in the body that is struggling, but there's also a cost in the emotional struggle. And I think that as we learn what it looks like to pay the cost, and I think that the hard part about that analogy is nobody wants to be in debt, right? Everyone wants to pay off their debt. But I'm not really talking about debt that correlates to financial debt. It's more of, we are paying for something, whether we're paying for it in, like I did, my body temperature regulation, or we're paying for it in the other thing I struggle with, thyroid driven anxiety. Our body is paying a price. And so we get to choose in some regards how we steer that payment. And with trauma healing, it is an intentional choice to pay a little bit of that in our emotional vulnerability, and to be willing to pay some of that emotional cost, like what it's going to actually cost to dig into those stories, to understand our narrative in a totally different way through our body instead of through our brain. That it does cost us something. And just to be aware that even though it does cost us something, that we are repaying something that is going to give us a level of freedom that we might not have ever even dreamed was possible. And so even though there is a cost, I think both of us would agree that in the end, while the cost is expensive, the product that you get at the other end, right? I mean, my body right now, just because it's the context of how I've had to live in it, feels like luxury. But I've paid a really high cost for that. I paid a high cost for it when it was feeling bad in those symptoms. And now I actually pay the cost of like doing the work. I'm going to do the work to help my body learn what resilience and coping is at a physiological level. And because of that, I mean, like now, whereas when I can tell honestly, before I felt like I was totally betrayed by my body and I was ashamed. In other words, I will tell a phrase I used to tell my husband early in our marriage: you married a lemon. Just know that. Like, you married a lemon. And now I haven't chosen to make lemonade out of lemons. I'm just not a lemon. I just didn't know it. Right? I'm not a lemon at all.
Right.
That kind of thing. And so the cost for me and the cost for you to get to this place of like, hey, I want to have a little bit more say in what that cost is. And also to know that when we do pay a cost, that it is going to pay off in some way, shape, or form, I think is the anchor of hope, right? That we have. Because everyone that's listening to this, if you haven't started the autoimmune journey of healing, it is expensive, like financially and emotionally. But I have to tell you, it is so worth it. And as those costs shift, you begin to realize more and more and more how worth it actually is.
Right. And I think it's like I tell my clients all the time, right? Choose your hard. It's all
Right.
hard.
Yeah.
You know, if you're staying sick, it's hard. If you put the effort in, it's hard. But the difference is that there's light at the end of the tunnel when
Mm-hmm.
you choose the healing journey. Because if you're just choosing to stay sick, it doesn't go anywhere but worse, you
Right.
know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's just as hard.
Right.
So choose your hard.
Yes, I
Yeah.
like that. Choose your hard.
Choose your hard. All right. So that was a very wide and a very deep discussion. And we did go a few places. Uh, yeah, we did. But I really, really, really appreciate you being here. And I can't thank you enough for what you've done for me and helped me walk through. And I can't imagine having a series like this without having you in the series.
Oh, thank
So
you.
again, thank you so much for being here. I've made a lot of progress because of you. And so I do appreciate that. So I know that there's going to be some people watching this that are going to wonder, how do I get my hands on this wonderful woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you probably have some information you'd love to share with the audience.
Yes. The best way to probably get a hold of me now is to direct message me through Instagram. My Instagram is Marisa Wandeler or Coach Marisa. Going to either one of those, and you don't even have to follow me to direct message me, but that's probably the place that I probably could access and respond to fast enough. I don't have Twitter. I'm not really, I don't update Facebook very often. I'm not techie in that way. At the same time, I do respond in a way that either say like, hey, this is my availability, or this is what I have availability, or try to help people find resources that are local to them, or maybe resources that might be a better fit. But that's probably the best way to contact me. I do offer online coaching right now is with COVID, and it's gone really well. I mean, you can probably speak to that, but the feedback that I've had from clients has been really, really good. I do have in the works some group kind of series, not similar to this, but more like intimate group work that can be done as an educational process. I'm working on a kind of a webinar series that is a private webinar series for specific groups that will really help people understand some of the science behind this, because I think for some of us, knowledge is important.
Yeah.
And so there is going to be educational opportunities there. So if you're interested in any of that, you can direct message me. And I do have a running list of how to contact people. I do have a WhatsApp kind of weekly reminder that I send to people, that people totally free, that you can have access to. So those are probably the best ways to contact me now. And yeah, I mean, or ask you more specific
Right.
ways to get to me.
You can ask me too. When you spell Marisa, it's with one S, Marisa, Wandeler, Wandeler. So you
Yes.
can find her very easily. And I hope we've provided something worthwhile, because I know that it isn't talked about a lot. It's not really a mainstream discussion. It's getting more and more attention.
Right.
Yeah, but it's hard to have a conversation about and really explain it well in a very short period of time. So
Right. Mm-hmm.
again, thank you for being here. And everybody, we will have another session next week of this. I was trying to do it every 2 weeks, but I've got so many people I want to bring on here that it's just kind of becoming an every week kind of a thing for now. And next week, we're going to talk about mindset. So these are just things that you can use to support yourself in your autoimmune journey beyond what I provide. So thanks for being here. And Marisa, again, thank you so much.
You're very
And
welcome.
if you guys have any questions at all with what you see, please reach out. Don't hesitate. If you found this on the Facebook page, you can reach me there, or you can email me at clientcare@yourhealthmadesimple.com. Hope you all have a great day. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.